I was 29 years old when Sarah left me at the altar. And I want to start by saying that I know how that sentence sounds. I know exactly what image it conjures: some heartless woman getting cold feet, a groom in a rented tux standing alone in front of his family while everyone whispers and looks away. That's what everyone assumed for 6 years, including me, and it turns out almost none of us were right. We'd been together for 5 years before the wedding, high school sweethearts who reconnected in our mid-20s after both of us had gone through our own separate college relationships that didn't work out. When we got back together, it felt inevitable in the way first loves sometimes do when they resurface later in life. Easier, calmer, like we'd both grown into people who fit together better than we had at 18. We got engaged after 2 years. We planned a wedding in my hometown of Asheville, North Carolina, at a restored barn venue in the mountains that Sarah had wanted since she was a teenager, the kind of place you book 14 months in advance. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in June. Everything was normal that morning. I remember getting ready with my brother and two close friends, drinking coffee, joking around the way you do. I remember Sarah's mother coming to find me about 40 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to start, her face pale in a way I initially mistook for typical wedding day stress. Sarah was gone. Not getting ready and running late gone. Gone. Her car was gone from the venue's parking lot. Her phone went straight to voicemail. There was no note, no explanation, nothing except an empty room where her dress still hung on a garment rack, untouched. I won't describe the next several hours in detail because, honestly, I've spent 6 years trying not to relive them in my head, and I don't need to relive them again here. What matters is that she never showed up. We never heard from her that day, and by the following week, once the initial shock faded into a kind of numb humiliation, the story that circulated through our friend group and both of our families was that Sarah had simply gotten cold feet and run. Too cowardly to say it to my face, choosing instead to vanish and leave 200 people, including her own parents, to clean up the wreckage. I hated her for a long time. I think that's an important, honest thing to say, because this isn't a story about a guy who nobly waited around wondering if there was a good explanation. I did not wait around wondering. I assumed the worst, the way you do when someone humiliates you in the most public way imaginable, and I let that assumption calcify into genuine bitterness for years. I deleted every photo. I moved to Nashville about 8 months later, partly for a job opportunity and partly because I couldn't stand running into people in Asheville who'd been at that barn, watching me wait. I dated on and off over those 6 years, nothing serious, nothing that stuck, though I don't think that was entirely because of Sarah. I think some of it was just me, genuinely not being ready, carrying something I hadn't processed, even after I'd convinced myself I had. I ran into her completely by accident this past March, in, of all places, a hospital cafeteria in Charlotte. I was there visiting my grandmother, who'd had a minor cardiac procedure and was recovering on the 4th floor. Sarah was there, in scrubs, clearly working, and it took me a solid 10 seconds of staring at her across the cafeteria before my brain fully processed that it was actually her and not just someone who looked like her. She saw me at almost the same moment. I watched her go through the same recognition, the same frozen half-second, and then something more complicated crossed her face. Not fear exactly, but a kind of resigned readiness, like she'd rehearsed this moment in her head many times over the years, and some part of her had actually been waiting for it. We ended up sitting down together, which surprised me as much as it apparently surprised her. I think we both understood without saying it out loud that 6 years is long enough for an accidental meeting to stop being pure ambush and start being an opportunity neither of us wanted to walk away unused. She was a nurse now, working in the cardiac unit, which is how she happened to be in that cafeteria the same day my grandmother was 3 floors up. She told me she'd moved to Charlotte about 4 years earlier. She asked about her family. I asked about hers, carefully, the way you do when you don't know what landmines might be buried in a question that used to be simple. And then, without me pushing for it, she told me why. 3 weeks before our wedding, Sarah had gone in for a routine physical, something she needed for a new job's insurance onboarding. Blood work came back with some abnormalities her doctor wanted to investigate further. A series of follow-up tests over the next 2 weeks led to a preliminary diagnosis of a genetic condition. She specifically asked me not to detail the exact condition in a story like this, out of respect for her own privacy, and I'm going to honor that. But I'll say it was serious, degenerative, and hereditary, something that could significantly affect both her long-term health and any future children we might have had, and something her own mother had actually experienced a milder version of that never been formally diagnosed until Sarah's own results connected the dots. She got the full confirmed diagnosis 4 days before our wedding. She told me that in the span of those 4 days, she went through something that, in hindsight, she recognized as a kind of trauma response that she was not equipped to process at 26 years old with a wedding 4 days away. She said she became consumed with a conviction, one she now believes was distorted by panic and fear rather than clear thinking, that she couldn't do that to me, that marrying me, knowing what she now knew about her own health and its implications for a future together, meant trapping me into a life I hadn't signed up for, a life of caregiving and grief and complicated family planning decisions that she didn't feel she had the right to ask of me without me fully understanding what I was choosing. Instead of telling me, she ran. She told me she'd started to write me an explanation more times than she could count over the years. Actual letters, some of them fully written, sitting in a drawer she still owned. She said every time she got close to sending one, shame took over. Shame about how she'd handled it, not just the diagnosis itself. She said the longer she waited, the harder it became to imagine any version of contacting me that wouldn't feel unbearably late and insufficient. So she simply didn't, and let the silence become its own kind of permanent decision. I sat with that for a long moment in that cafeteria, genuinely unsure what I felt. Part of me, a part I'm not proud of, still felt angry. Not about the diagnosis, obviously, but about 6 years of assuming the worst about someone I'd loved, when the truth was so much more complicated and, honestly, so much sadder than the story everyone had settled on. Another part of me felt an almost overwhelming grief for 26-year-old Sarah, alone, with terrifying news, making an isolated, panicked decision that she then had to live with the consequences of for 6 years, largely by herself. Since apparently only her mother and one sister knew the real reason even now. I asked her, eventually, how she was doing. Health-wise, she told me the condition had been manageable so far with treatment and monitoring, that her prognosis was better than what she'd initially feared in that terrified first week of diagnosis, and that she'd made her peace, mostly, with what her life looked like now. We talked for almost 2 hours that day, well past when I needed to go back up and see my grandmother. We exchanged numbers before I left, both of us fairly quiet about what that might or might not mean. I'm not going to tell you we're back together, because that would make this story a cleaner story than real life actually is, and I don't think either of us knows yet if that's even the right ending. What I can tell you is that we've talked several times since that day in the cafeteria. Carefully, slowly, like two people relearning something that used to come naturally and now requires a kind of deliberate patience neither of us had at 26. What I keep coming back to, more than anything else, is how much pain could have been avoided, for both of us, if she'd trusted me with the truth, instead of trusting her own fear about what she thought I could or couldn't handle. I think about the version of me that existed for 6 years, nursing a bitterness rooted in a story that was never actually true. And I wonder what those years might have looked like if either of us had known then what I know now. I don't have a neat lesson to wrap this up with. I just know that I don't hate her anymore. And I know that surprised me more than almost anything else that's happened in the last 6 years.